In considering the question about what is necessary for any true conservative resurgence in America, we must be clear-eyed about the engine driving such an undertaking. It must be more than a commitment to fiscal conservatism, more than a nod to family values, and certainly more than empty rhetoric. A genuine, deep-seated revival of American conservatism can only be steered by those, in the words of Francis Schaeffer, possess true truth, grounded in a Christian worldview. This is not an optional add-on or mere tradition. Rather, it is the imperative built into the very DNA of the American order. As Schaeffer also observed, America cannot simply rely on morality if that morality floats in the secular ether without God. For without an objective transcendent authority, we are left with only opinions, preferences, and on such sand no society can stand. First question that we need to ask is, what are we conserving? The word conserve, similar to the word destroy, is ultimately meaningless unless we qualify its meaning. What exactly are we conserving? In the first few centuries of Christianity, the conservatives were the Roman pagans opposing the spread of Christianity. So when we describe ourselves as conservatives and fight for conservative values, it is critical that we recognize what those values are and where they originated. The assertion that these values come from, quote, natural law implies that they are self-evident. But that doesn't seem to align with nature. I have yet to see a silverback gorilla on trial for sexually assaulting a young female in its gorilla community. In this instance, the laws of nature, or natural law, seem to drive that gorilla to act with impunity. The idea of natural law as the origin of Western values is a dangerous step toward the pagan pre-Christian world praised by Nietzsche, a world that repudiates weakness and honors power. Is that the natural law we should be basing our conservatism on? A law where the weak are viewed as slaves and subjects to the powerful? This is the law of the jungle. It's very natural. But Christ came to redeem us from the natural laws, or as Paul described it, the laws of sin and death that crush the human spirit and freedom. Christianity as America's foundation. The Constitution itself, and its framework and assumptions, presupposes a Christian populace. This is not to suggest that it was only intended for Christians, but rather it assumes citizens shaped by Christian moral principles and respect for biblical order. John Adams famously noted, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to govern any other." What Adams understood, and what we are quickly forgetting, is that the constitutional system was tailored for people who understood self-restraint, virtue, and the responsibility that accompanies freedom. The Christian faith teaches a higher accountability and reinforces personal restraint, two elements indispensable to making a society that values limited government and individual liberty. As Alexis de Tocqueville remarked during his visit to America in the early 19th century, quote, "Religion in America takes no direct part in the government of society, but it must be regarded as the first of their political institutions." He goes on to say, "I do not know whether all Americans have a sincere faith in their religion, for who can read the human heart? But I am certain that they hold it to be indispensable to the maintenance of republican institutions." De Tocqueville recognized what secular conservatives today so often miss, that the civic order requires a robust spiritual backbone. The energy that fueled American greatness, he said, was found not in its halls and political power, but in the pulpits of its churches. The moral courage and vision of committed Christians. The conservative movement, if it is to reclaim lost ground, requires men and women who do not merely mimic the outward signs of conservatism, but embody its spirit. A spirit that cannot be sustained without a transcendent moral framework. As Francis Schaeffer asserts, the basic problem of the Christians in this country in the last 80 years or so is that they have seen things in bits and pieces instead of totals. End quote. Christians must see that piecemeal changes in policy will fail if they do not reflect and reinforce the eternal principles on which America was built. This is not merely about laws, but about moral vision that infuses every aspect of our culture and society. Consider also the writings of C.S. Lewis, who argued that the loss of objective moral standards would render humanity little more than a collection of appetites swayed by the strongest desires of the moment, rather than by fixed principles. This has come to fruition in the secular order that rules much of the West today. It will continue to erode the freedoms that are only meaningful when grounded in objective truth. The role of the church in cultural leadership. Historically, the church has been the moral compass guiding Western civilization. It was the clergy in America who upheld the rights of individuals against tyranny. It was the Puritan ethic of hard work, integrity, and justice that helped shape early American society. De Tocqueville observed that American pastors, quote, directed the habits of the community, and by regulating the family, they regulated the state. End quote. The church has always been the incubator of civic virtue and the furnace that forges moral courage. Yet today, the church has, to a great extent, retreated from its role of prophet and teacher, and has often replaced a radical biblical faith with a tame, marketable version that is of little consequence to the surrounding culture. The kind of conservatism that can save America must have a spine, and it must have substance. It must be the conservatism of Daniel, willing to stand against the crowd, and of the Apostle Paul, whose words carried power because they were rooted in the truth of the gospel. This brand of conservatism does not settle for pragmatic half measures or campaign slogans, but calls for a return to foundational truths. It is only the church, alive with the Spirit of God, that can be the furnace for such a movement. The path forward: a Christian-led conservative resurgence. To revive conservative principles, Christians must again take up the mantle of leadership, not as mere advocates of family values, but as bearers of the gospel truth that provides the only solid foundation for those values. De Tocqueville famously warned that America would flourish so long as Christianity was intimately linked to the institutions of the country. If we are to see a resurgence of American strength and character, it must flow from the pulpits to the town halls, from homes to Capitol Hill, always pointing back to a God who judges both men and nations. In summary, the Constitution, designed for a Christian people, cannot long endure in a secular culture divorced from its moral roots. These philosophers and many others understood this with prophetic clarity. Only when Christians fully embrace their role as cultural leaders, not timidly, not apologetically, but confidently, can we hope to see a restoration of the principles that once made America a beacon of freedom and virtue. This is not merely a political strategy. It is a calling, and it is the only path forward for any enduring conservative movement.